What if the next major flashpoint isn't in the Middle East, but just 90 miles off the coast of Florida? Because right now, behind closed doors, something big may already be in motion. As of April 16th, new reports suggest that the United States military, under President Trump, is quietly preparing for potential large-scale action against Cuba. Not publicly, not loudly, but in a way that looks calculated, deliberate, and possibly very close to becoming real. And if that sounds familiar, it should. The comparison being drawn is the recent operation against Maduro. The idea now circulating is that Cuba could be next in line. In this video, we're going to break down what that actually means, what kind of military resistance Cuba could realistically offer, how strong or weak their defenses really are, and what a potential operation could look like if it moves from planning to execution. Before we go deeper, quick reminder: if you follow geopolitical updates and want real-time breakdowns like this, hit subscribe and turn notifications on. It helps more than you think, and it keeps you ahead of the curve. Now here's the bigger picture. The idea of removing Cuba's communist government is not new. This has been a strategic goal, or at least a recurring ambition, for multiple U.S. administrations going all the way back to the Cold War era, when Fidel Castro first took power. Decades later, that objective never fully disappeared. It just evolved. And now, under Trump, it appears to be back on the front burner. According to reports that surfaced after the Maduro operation, Trump allegedly gave his administration a timeline. By the end of 2026, the Cuban government should be gone. That's not some vague long-term vision, that's a countdown, and we're already months into that clock. Around mid-April, a major piece from USA Today added fuel to the fire. The headline pointed to increased Pentagon activity, planning scenarios, contingency options, operational outlines, all centered around Cuba. The key detail? This isn't being done in the open. It's quiet, low profile, and based on conditional execution. In other words, the infrastructure for action is being built so that if the order comes, everything is ready to go. Two sources familiar with the situation spoke under anonymity, which usually signals something serious enough that people aren't willing to attach their names to it publicly. According to them, these preparations represent a clear escalation in tensions between Washington and Havana, tensions that started intensifying earlier this year. Back in January, the U.S. took a major step by restricting oil shipments into Cuba. That might sound technical, but it's actually a huge deal. Cuba relies heavily on imported energy, and most of that supply came from Venezuela. Once Maduro was removed from power, that pipeline was effectively cut off. What remained, some limited support from Russia, wasn't enough to compensate. The result? Pressure. Economic pressure, political pressure, and ultimately pressure on the regime itself. From the Pentagon's perspective, this is about readiness. Their official stance is that they prepare for multiple scenarios at all times, and they are ready to act on presidential orders if needed. That's standard language, but in this context, it carries more weight. Interestingly, early discussions about escalation didn't even start in mainstream outlets. They first appeared in independent reports and quickly spread through Washington circles, Capitol Hill, policy groups, insiders. That's often how these stories move when something sensitive is unfolding. At the same time, both the U.S. and Cuba have acknowledged that there are still attempts to find a diplomatic off-ramp. Talks exist, communication channels are open, but no one really knows how far either side is willing to go to avoid confrontation. So where does that leave us? Right now, somewhere in between negotiation and preparation for conflict, and that's usually the most dangerous phase. Now here's where things get even more interesting. In late March, a series of unexplained incidents started hitting Cuba's infrastructure. Fires, disruptions, unexplained damage, nothing officially confirmed as sabotage, but nothing fully explained either. And if you've been following global patterns, this starts to look familiar. Something very similar happened in Iran before escalation there. Fires, explosions, seemingly random disruptions. But when you step back, it looks less random and more like groundwork. Not open conflict, but shaping the environment before it begins, weakening systems, testing responses, creating instability. And now, that same pattern appears to be unfolding in Cuba. Think of it like this. Before any major operation, there's usually a phase where conditions are quietly set. Not announced, not obvious, but critical. If that's what we're seeing here, then this may already be further along than most people realize. Now let's look at the political messaging coming from both sides, because this is where tone often reveals intent. Trump has been fairly direct. In multiple statements, he's described Cuba as a failing state and hinted that once the situation with Iran stabilizes, attention could shift elsewhere. At one point, he framed it as a choice. Either Cuba makes a deal, or the United States will take whatever steps it believes are necessary. He also pointed to support from Cuban and Venezuelan communities in the U.S., many of whom have long opposed their home governments. According to him, there's been decades of waiting for change, and that moment may finally be approaching. On the other side, Cuba's leadership is taking a completely different stance. President Miguel Diaz-Canel has made it clear that if there is any kind of military action, the country will resist. Not partially, not symbolically, fully. He's openly said that defending the revolution is a matter of principle, even if it comes at the highest cost. From his perspective, there is no justification for U.S. intervention, whether it's a full invasion or a targeted operation. And if it happens, the response will be force, not negotiation. He also argues that Cuba doesn't pose a real threat to U.S. national security, framing any potential action as unnecessary and likely unpopular with the American public. So you've got two narratives forming, one side preparing, possibly moving toward action, the other side preparing to resist, regardless of the outcome. Now let's talk about the actual military balance, because this is where reality tends to override rhetoric. Cuba does have air defense systems, but most of them are decades old. We're talking Cold War-era technology. Systems like the S-125, introduced in the early 1960s, are still considered part of their core defense. They also operate the S-75, which goes even further back into the 1950s, and the 2K-12 Cub from the late 1960s. On top of that, they have portable Igla systems from the early 1980s. These are shoulder-fired missiles, useful in certain situations, but extremely limited compared to modern systems. The key issue here is not just age, it's capability. These systems were designed for a completely different era of warfare, against modern stealth aircraft, advanced electronic warfare, and next-generation targeting systems. Their effectiveness drops dramatically. We're talking about platforms like the B-2, F-22, F-35, and the newer B-21 Raider. These are built to penetrate and neutralize exactly this kind of outdated defense network. So, realistically, if a conflict begins, the first phase would almost certainly focus on eliminating those defenses. Once air superiority is established, operations become significantly easier, whether that involves targeted strikes, special forces, or something larger. A limited operation might resemble a fast in-and-out mission, high precision, minimal footprint. A full-scale invasion would be a completely different scenario, involving far more resources and time. As of now, nothing has officially been launched, but the key takeaway is this: planning is happening, statements are being made, conditions may already be shifting behind the scenes, and all of this is unfolding while tensions with Iran are still unresolved, sitting in a fragile ceasefire phase. So the question becomes, is this just pressure, or is it the early stage of something much bigger? That's what we need to watch closely. Because if this moves from preparation to execution, it won't just affect Cuba. It could reshape the entire geopolitical landscape in the region. Let me know what you think about this situation. And if you want more breakdowns like this, stay tuned, because this story is far from over.